Hello, today we're going to be talking about energy systems, so this is unit 3.3, and in this first video we're going to be talking about respiration, the process of respiration, and ATP. So the first thing you need to know is you need to be able to label all of the components of an animal cell. So this is going to include all of the cell organelles which you see listed here. You also need to be able to explain the role that they have within the cell. For the exam as well, you could be asked to identify the different parts of the mitochondrial structure. So the mitochondria is a cell organelle. This is where the process of respiration takes place. So you need to know that it's present in all cells except for red blood cells. That proteins of the electron transport chain, which is one of the energy systems that we'll talk about in a bit more detail later, they are stored in the inner membrane. So as you can see, that's the highly curved membrane on the inside. And that the Krebs cycle, which is another part of the aerobic energy system, that takes place inside the matrix. So that's right in the center of the mitochondria. So let's talk about what we mean by respiration. So respiration is defined as the controlled release of energy in the form of ATP from organic compounds in cells. So essentially the breakdown of food to produce energy. Here we have a simple word equation which represents cellular respiration. So on the left hand side you can see here we've got glucose, which we essentially get from our food. We've got oxygen, which we breathe into our bodies, and that then gets turned into carbon dioxide and water, which our body gets rid of and excretes, and ATP, or energy. And we're going to talk a little bit more in a second about what ATP is. The important thing to remember here is that respiration, when we're talking about the process of respiration, is not the same as breathing. So we need to distinguish between the cellular respiration process and the mechanical process of ventilation. So we're going to use those two different words to distinguish between the two processes. So mechanical ventilation, which will refer to breathing in and out, getting air into our lungs, and cellular respiration being the breakdown of our food within our cells to produce energy. So here we've got a slightly more complicated diagram representing cellular respiration, and at the top here we've got food such as peanuts. So in this example, peanuts contain polysaccharides, so carbohydrate, fats, and also proteins. And each of these three macronutrients can be used as substrates to produce energy. And we're going to look at the different systems of producing energy in a bit more detail in future videos. But essentially, all of these systems are there to produce ATP. So this is our body's currency for energy, for powering muscle contractions and other metabolic processes. So adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, is an energy-rich compound, and it's what the body uses to power muscle contraction and other metabolic processes. It's our body's currency for energy, for doing work. So there might be many other ways or many other formats in which energy is stored in the body, but they all have to be converted into, or the energy has to be transferred into ATP before it can get used. So ATP itself is made up of a smaller compound of adenosine and three phosphate groups which are attached. So hence we have the name triphosphate. And this is what one looks like. So we've got our adenosine group on the side, and we've got our three phosphate groups attached to it. So hence the name triphosphate. So here's a diagram showing the ATP molecule. So here we've got our adenosine group, and we've got our three phosphates attached. And what happens is when the ATP is broken down, it forms ADP, so adenosine diphosphate, and it's called diphosphate because once we break off one of the phosphate groups, we're left with two remaining phosphate groups attached to the adenosine group. So it becomes adenosine diphosphate and an inorganic phosphate as well. At the same time that this happens, so by removing a phosphate, we produce energy. And this, as I say, is what our body uses to power cellular reactions and muscle contractions. So what do you notice first thing about the reaction? Well, we've got water going in, and it ends up being split. So we've got the H plus and the OH of our H2O, so water ends up getting split. So this is called a hydrolysis reaction. So it's the splitting or the lysis of water. And if we remember, we talked about condensation reactions where water is produced. So this is the opposite reaction. So as I say, we've got our three phosphates, and we end up with our ADP, which contains two phosphates. So theoretically, we could break off more of the phosphates, but actually it's not really worth our while because there's much more energy that's contained in this first bond here. So when we break off our first phosphate, a lot of energy is released, leaving us with ADP. We could then break it down even further and break off a second phosphate, leaving us with adenosine phosphate. However, that would only give us some energy. And then in the final bond here, if we were to completely break it down into adenosine, it would only give us a tiny bit of energy. So actually it's this first bond which provides us with most of the energy. So essentially what happens in our body is our ATP is constantly being broken down into ADP, as we can see here, and then being built back up into ATP. So how does this happen in reality? Well, we have an energy input to the system, and that's obviously energy which comes into our body from our food. And we have an energy output, which is what we use for cellular work. So energy from our food comes in, and it resynthesizes or rebuilds ADP plus a phosphate into ATP, which is then broken down when we need to use it for energy, and breaking it back down into ADP and a phosphate. That energy can then be used for whatever our body needs it for. So you need to think of this sort of like an iPhone. So an iPhone battery contains a certain amount of charge. At certain points it needs to be recharged, and there's lots of different ways we can recharge that iPhone battery. So we could plug it into the mains, we could plug it into a laptop, we could put it into a battery case. And all of these different methods will take energy from a particular source and put it into the iPhone battery. Once it's in the iPhone battery, it can then be used by the iPhone to power the phone itself. So this is a continuous cycle of the battery being used up and then being recharged again. So there's an overall energy input from whichever energy source we want, and the energy being used up in powering the phone. But everything has to be transferred into ATP before the body can use it. So ATP, to put it simply, is the currency which provides energy to drive cellular functions. And this obviously includes muscular contractions, which, as we're sports scientists, this is what we're interested in. So if you can remember back to the little bit that we talked about muscular contractions, you'll probably recognize this cycle here. So this is our cross-bridge cycle, where our myosin heads attach to the thin filaments, and they then draw the thin filaments past the thick filaments. And this is powered by ATP. So this is probably one of the most important, certainly in terms of sport, one of the most important functions of ATP in our body. So that concludes this short video. if you'd like to take the quick test on respiration and ATP, please click on the link here. Thanks very much.